Today we're going to talk about Kashrut, dietary laws, a diet for the soul. It's a befitting concept if you think about it. If the body is a repository to for the soul, then should it not be made a fitting repository? The body has a certain element of holiness to it, and so we should be very respectful to treat the body in that manner with its inherent holiness. Ideally, we should all be vegetarians. Right? Why? If you take a look at the first chapter of the Torah, that's what God said to Adam. I give you all the fruit of the trees and of the field for food. End of discussion. There's no talk about meat whatsoever. When's the first time that mankind ate meat?
After the flood.
After the flood. Why? The vegetation was destroyed with the flood. There's nothing else to eat. That's like the Torah. The Torah talks about locusts as being kosher, certain species of locusts. You can eat certain species of locusts. Yeah. Why? Because when a locust comes through your town, there's nothing else to eat but the locust. I guess if you fry it up, it'll be as good as anything. Anything fried tastes good. So God commanded Noah to take with him seven of the clean kinds of animals, which means the kosher kind, and where he took only two of all the other animals. So ideally we should be vegetarians. But God in effect says to us, if you must eat meat to survive, of all the animals that I created, I give you permission to eat just these. Now, who's done the homework? Animals that, what are the characteristics of an animal? Has to have split hoof and chew its cud. Fish has to have what? Scales and fins. And birds must not be birds of prey, which are specified in the Torah. Like, so an ostrich is not kosher, and therefore an ostrich egg is not kosher either. Or a hawk or whatever. Well, let's analyze these restrictions. Do you know what chewing the cud is? It's like you chew up some grass, and the animal has two stomachs. It like splits it up, and then it swallows it into the next stomach. Right? I once came across a study of a scientist that would in Britain. They would, this is back in the 70s when it was the big discussion was how do we feed this world of ours that's getting larger in terms of people and smaller in terms of land. One of the discoveries they were trying to find was to be able to make milk from grass like cows do. Imagine if you could produce milk from grass, you could make everything parv. Like real, we'll get to what's parv mean.
No.
Parv means it's not meat, it's not milk. Therefore, you can eat it with either. Because Judaism will not let eat meat and milk together. Why? 3 times in the Torah it says you should not cook a baby goat in the milk of its mother. 3 times the Torah never repeats anything unless there's a great meaning to it. So there are 3 things we learn from this, the sages tell us. You shouldn't cook meat and milk together. You shouldn't eat meat and milk cook, and you shouldn't sell it. You shouldn't have benefit from it. Yes?
Rabbi, can you eat cheese and milk together?
Cheese is milk. Cheese is milk.
But you can't eat cheese with milk.
Sure. Cheese is not meat. We're talking about beef or chicken with milk. Why is chicken forbidden? Because chicken doesn't have milk. You can understand a cow because a cow makes milk. But how do you understand the chicken?
Because he's an animal, just like us.
So according to the Torah, strictly,
Same process, just like us.
strictly according to the Torah, a chicken is permissible to be eaten with milk because it doesn't give milk. Shouldn't cook a baby goat in the milk of its mother. But the rabbis felt, just like you said, that chicken is so much like meat with fat and blood, and therefore we should treat it like meat. But it's a rabbinic injunction; it's not a Torah injunction. I'm dealing with too many things at once, but we'll get to discuss each of them. Split hoofs and chew their cut. Interestingly enough, I may have mentioned this to you. I don't remember if I did or did not. There are 4 or 5 species of animal in this world that only have one of those properties, and the Torah lists all of them. Don't be fooled, it says, into thinking that these are kosher. Well, the pig has split hoofs and doesn't chew its cud. So the pig became a symbol of deception among Jews, because it looks like it should be kosher, because it has split hoofs. But nevertheless, it's not kosher because it doesn't chew its cud. A camel chews its cud but doesn't have split hoofs. It has like paws type of thing. There's something called a rock badger. You know what a rock badger is? It's a type of hare. There are 2 types of rabbits or hares or whatever you want to say that the Torah lists as well. But the remarkable thing about this to me is that if you think about it, the Torah is written about 1300, 1250 BCE in a specific part of the world, in the desert of Sinai. How would it be possible for the Torah to know that these are the only 4 animals in the entire world that have only one of these properties, if it was not divinely given? So it's not a definitive proof for the divine origin of Torah, but it's a very interesting thought to ponder. Let's see. The word kosher itself means correct, fit, proper. So food can be kosher, and other things can be kosher. You know, matzah. You have Passover coming up. Tefillin can be kosher. Mezuzah can be kosher. Talis can be kosher. They all have if it's not made correctly, it's not kosher. Also, Talmud tells us that one shouldn't say that I don't like non-kosher food, and that's why I don't eat it. As a matter of fact, the Talmud should say it smells It says we should say it smells wonderful. It's probably delicious. It probably is something I would enjoy eating. However, God told me not to do it, and therefore I don't do it. How does it phrase it? A man ought not to say, I do not wish to eat the flesh of a pig. It's in the middle of page 98. Because I don't like it. Rather, he should say, I do wish to do these things, but my Father in heaven has decreed otherwise. Ultimately, that's the reason for all these laws. You might say that there are health reasons. That's why people were kosher. That back in the Dark Ages, when people didn't cook pork sufficiently, they got trichinosis, or when they used wooden plates and there was bacteria that developed and the mixture of meat and milk was harmful. There may be some truth to this, but that's not the reasons. Certainly there were whole non-Jewish communities that lived just as healthy a life as the Jewish communities did. And there are many foods that are not kosher that are very healthy for you. I mean, so a lot of the seafood is very healthy. It contains iodine and other minerals and things like that. The reasons for kashrut are not health reasons. The Torah spells out what the reasons are. In essence, it says, because kadoshim to you, you should be a holy people unto me. And eating these foods creates a sense of holiness. Now, it doesn't mean to say that there are not more profound meanings in all of these laws. There are. And we will talk about some of them. But those aren't the reasons for them. The reasons why we observe them is because God says so. We trust Him. And He says that this will make us holy. And it will make our bodies a holy receptacle for our souls. Once that happens, when our bodies are a fitting receptacle for our souls, it's much easier for the soul within us to really come out. And for us to be the selves that we are. That's very important.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I've talked to people who, friends of mine, who were born Jewish and raised Jewish, and I asked them about kosher. And I've asked 3 people, and they always say it's because of health reasons and nothing else. And it's interesting that they all say that and think that that's the reason for keeping kosher.
We're all masters at rationalizations. You know? If they don't want to be kosher, they have to rationalize it and say there's a reason for it. Because everybody considers himself to be a good person. So you must find reasons for doing things which might be considered wrong.
Do you think maybe it's the emphasis on the day-to-day activities of being Jewish over the spirituality, maybe? And
No, I think it's just that they lost touch with being Jewish, period.
yeah, I mean, that may be.
There's a whole sociological phenomenon. Part of it goes back to the fact that in America, the Jewish community initially was a community of immigrants, escaping abject poverty and great oppression. So when they came to these shores in the 19th and early 20th centuries, the main concern that most Jews had was, now I'll be able to feed my family without worrying. And they would get, and when they came here, they often had to work in the sweatshops, 16, 18 hours a day, 6 days a week, and they spent that 7th day sleeping. They lived in tenements. Kids practically raised themselves in the streets. And when the kids went to school, they knew English because they were in school, and they knew their way around the system, and the parents didn't. So they considered themselves a little smarter than the parents. So things that the parents stood for, the children looked down upon. They didn't have this moral and religious, spiritual upbringing. There was no time for that. And the thought was at the time in these ghetto populations, get out of the ghetto, and they did. They went into the suburbs, and in the suburbs, they to a great extent they abandoned their Jewishness. They didn't abandon the fact that they're Jewish, because in the suburbs in America, if you're looking back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, it was very important to identify as a religious group. Everybody belonged to a church or to a synagogue. So when you moved to the suburbs, you joined the synagogue. You never went there. Maybe Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur when your kid had a bar mitzvah, but you identified with it. And this was a whole sociological phenomenon. And in the process, Jews have tremendously lost sight of their Jewish upbringing and the spiritual power of it. I grew up in a home of my mother was 3rd generation American. There was almost no Yiddishkeit in the home. My father was 3rd generation Yiddish. Well, actually, he was 1st generation American, and of course he came from Russia himself when he was 6 months old. His parents were Yiddish secularists. I don't know if you could understand what that was. That's another history story in itself. But these people were secularists, his parents. I mean, I loved them dearly, but there was no real Yiddishkeit in the home, no sense of Jewishness, except they went to shul on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It wasn't a kosher home. My father had to learn his lessons for bar mitzvah. They hired a tutor for that because that's a coming of age sort of thing. But that's as far as it went. I would say the majority of the Jewish community grew up in America. Grew up in an atmosphere like that. The real spiritual communities were the communities of Europe that were decimated by the Nazis. and as many Jews who have abandoned their Jewishness today, there are also many Jews now who feel a great void and are looking for meaning and searching. It's like all of you are searching. So, if you talk to Jews why they're not kosher, they'll feel a little guilty and look for reasons, and they'll point to the easy reasons and say it's for health reasons. It never was. It never ever was. You could never really point out a community that a time where the Jewish community really was better off health-wise than most of the other communities, with probably exception at some point to the time of the bubonic plague that Jews didn't suffer as much because according to Jewish law, before you eat you have to wash your hands. So if you keep washing your hands, I mean, if you think about catching disease, the best way to catch cold from your kid is you play with your kids and you have the germs on your hand, and you pick up an apple and you eat it. Now you get sick too. But if you have to wash your hands before you eat anything, it would help. The truth of the matter is, thousands and thousands of Jews died in the plagues also. So that was never really the reason. But I'm glad you brought it up. Also, being kosher teaches us a great lesson of self-discipline. We are masters over our bodies and not our bodies over us. Our craving for food is very much related to our animal nature. So that's what animals do. From the time they awaken till they fall asleep, they search for food. And if you think about it, if we consume our time, so much of our time thinking about or planning food, and then our bodies, our animal nature has become master over us and suppressed our soul. Not that food isn't important. We even sanctify food. I mean, how does a Jew celebrate? Makes a meal. That's why when you have, for instance, a bar mitzvah or bar mitzvah reception or wedding reception, it must be kosher, because it's part of the sacraments of the occasion. To make it non-kosher is a desecration of it. Yes?
I'm just curious. During the flood or before the flood, when God ordered Noah to bring the animals aboard
The ark?
Why didn't he I'm not trying to outthink God, but it seemed like he would make provision for him to bring enough vegetation or food aboard so they wouldn't have to resort to.
They were on board a long time. Months and months and months. So it wouldn't have lasted. They did. I'm sure they did. And that's what they lived on while they were on board. I mean, the whole logistics of what they had to bring on board is another story to talk about. And how do you have two of every species on an ark? And what size is that ark? And how... There's a lot of questions to talk about. But considering that I just spent 2 semesters dealing with the first day of creation, it'll be a long time till I get up that. But hopefully we'll get to answer some of those questions too. But we sanctify our food, and we bless it before we eat it. Imagine, you're hungry and you really want something, but before you eat it, you have to stop for a second and realize where this food is coming from, and ultimately it comes from God. And you say a blessing over it, thanking God for the food. And the blessing accomplishes 2 things, I think. It accomplishes the sense of gratitude that you have for the food, but also, and you won't see this in many places, but I think when you say a blessing over food before you eat it, it sanctifies that food. You're putting it into your body, which should be holy. You're making it holy. So if you have a conscious effort when you're saying a blessing, that piece of food, it's an apple. It could be wine for Kiddush, but it could be, a peanut butter sandwich. I don't care what it is. You're putting it into your body, you make it holy with the blessing. And then you eat it. And then after you finish eating, you say the blessings you say after food. Again, thanking God. Makes you pause before you go on with your life to thank God, to be appreciative. Before you eat it, even though you're hungry, to be appreciative. It creates a consciousness within you that you are master over your body. And when you go shopping in the stores, you check the labels to see if it's kosher. You look at the ingredients. You know that you know the old expression that we've been saying since the 70s. You are what you eat. But there's a lot to say about that. A lot to say about that. So if you are what you eat, to be careful what you put into your bodies. Yes.
Okay, that's the same logic that Christians use. They say once you pray over the food, then it's become okay, but it's kosher. Not kosher.
Christians say that it's not what goes in your mouth that counts, but what goes out. Comes out. Is this the way it goes?
Jesus said.
Right. So it's not so much important what you eat, but what you say. But you can't take something that's treif. You can't take a piece of pork and make it holy and eat it. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. The holiness, not that there is not holiness in all of God's creations. Not that there's not holiness in a piece of pork, in a pig. There was a Hasidic Rebbe I once heard about that took the hide of a skin, the skin of a pig, and made a belt for the Torah out of it. They felt all God's creation should be able to glorify in God. Now, you're looking aghast at this, and most Jews probably would, most rabbis probably would. But it's very interesting, the concept. We believe there's holiness in everything. Anyway, the idea is that, again, we are master over our bodies and not our animal nature master over us. Okay, let me go into the details of what it takes to be kosher. He has it here on page 104. I have, by the way, booklets that I have prepared some 20 years ago when I was a rookie about being kosher. It's a lot of it's based on this book and other sources that I have. In the back, I have a detailed list of ingredients. So when you're looking at food, you know what you're looking at. And I'll go over some of this with you. I'd like you to take it with you before you leave. Now we know which animals are kosher. We just talked about it. Those are split hoods, chew their cud. But that in itself doesn't make an animal kosher. It must be slaughtered kosher. I've been to slaughterhouses. Yeah. When you look at a non-Jewish slaughterhouse, sometimes they'll just hit the animal over the head with a baseball bat and skin them while they're dying. Or they'll give them an electric shock. That's why people say the kosher meat is much more tender than non-kosher meat. Because an animal freezes up when it's under shock. When you slaughter an animal, first you take a knife, a sharp knife, which must be inspected twice. Once before you kill the animal, once after. Now, what happens is there's a shochet who's the slaughterer, and then there's the mashkiach who's the inspector. The inspector will inspect the knife, will take his thumb and rub it over the blade 3 times, one on either side and over the middle. If he feels the slightest nick, it has to be sharpened. Can't be used. And after he slaughters the animal, he has to do that again. If he feels the slightest nick, it means it caused undue pain to the animal. The animal's rendered not kosher. Did you ever get a paper cut and not feel it? It's about the kind of cutting you have to do. No chopping motion. A very even back and forth motion. It's near the jugular vein under the neck. And after the animal is slaughtered, they're hoisted up to drain all the blood out. Blood is considered the soul of the animal. Dam hu nefesh. Blood is like the soul of the animal, so we don't eat blood. It's considered distasteful, not just with a taste, the whole spiritual concept. One of the theories about why God permits us to eat meat is that man has a bloody nature, a nature to kill, and that expresses itself all too often in this world of ours. If you can confine that and give it an outlet into killing animals that you need to eat, if that sort of satisfies that desire within you, that will be sufficient. And that's one theory about why God permits us to eat meat. But again, if you're eating it, it has to be done in a holy way. So for instance, a deer is kosher because it has split hoofs and chews its cud. But you can't shoot a deer and eat it. You gotta catch it. Turn it around, and then slaughter it properly. I mean, that's why it's a very rare occasion where you go to a kosher butcher shop, and find venison. This doesn't happen. Once the meat is slaughtered, what they do is they skin it, and then they take out the important organs, especially the lungs, and they inspect them. If the organs are diseased, the animal's not kosher. It goes to the non-kosher markets. There was a time, 25 years ago, where a full 90% of the meat that was slaughtered on the east coast of America was slaughtered kosher. So what did non-Jews eat? They ate the meat that was rejected by the kosher markets, the diseased meat. It may be stamped grade A U.S. government, but it could be diseased. And there's a whole tractate of the Talmud devoted to how do you inspect these organs to make sure that the animal is kosher, especially the lungs. If you find, for instance, lesions on the lungs, it means there's some sort of leukemia there. You're not allowed to eat it. They go to the non-kosher markets. So when you're eating meat, at McDonald's or wherever, just know what the standards are. Okay? If they inspect the lungs and they see that there were adhesions there, but they healed, and there's a scab, but it's healed, it would be considered kosher. Now, this is the difference, but what we call glatt kosher and kosher. Glatt kosher, glatt is a Yiddish word. It means smooth. It means there were absolutely no adhesions on the lungs, and all the organs were disease-free. There was virtually no conception of glatt kosher until the 20th century, and it really flowered in America. And now glatt kosher has become the epitome of kosher standard. In my mind, it's a ridiculous standard. It's an excuse to raise the price of meat a few cents per pound.
I've seen that on some of the kosher.
Yeah. And the reason is, if the Talmud tells you that an animal is kosher, if the lesions have healed, then it's kosher. What's the difference if it's smooth or it's not smooth? It's like a pregnant woman. How pregnant are you? Well, you're pregnant. Either it's kosher or it's not kosher. You understand? So, I have a big problem with the whole concept of glatt. The problem is, when I lived, for instance, in New York, it was virtually impossible to find a kosher butcher who was himself an observant Jew, and therefore would be very trustworthy, who didn't sell glatt, because that's what the kosher community, religious community, wanted, and it paid for him financially to do that. Certainly there can never be such a thing as glatt kosher chickens. It's only first to beef and veal. But there are laws about the innards of a chicken, and how do you inspect that as well. There's an old story, for instance, of several stories. You see, until past 40, 50 years, if you wanted to eat a chicken, what did you do? If you were Jewish, you went to the market, you bought yourself a chicken, a live chicken. You took it over to the shochet, and he would slaughter it for you. And then you'd take it home and take off the feathers, and then you'd have to soak it and salt it. In order to get the blood out of meat, either you're talking about fowl or beef, you have to soak it in water for about an hour to soften it, and then you salt it with kosher salt. Kosher salt is the coarse salt. You know, but in the Northeast they know a lot about kosher salt, even though it's even the communities where they're not Jewish, because they use it to throw on the snow in the wintertime. It just melts the ice and stuff. And this year probably they had a lot of occasion to do that. But you would salt it, and I think what the procedure is for he says a half hour of soaking, and you place the salted meat or fowl on a flat surface, which is kept inclined at an angle to let the blood drain off, and you keep it there with the salt on it for about an hour, and you let the blood drain down or drain out. So let's say you did that. You took it home, but you looked at the innards of the chicken. Something didn't seem right. So what would you do? You take it to the rabbi and see if it's kosher. And rabbis were trained, and I was trained in the laws of kashrut to be able to decide whether something is kosher or not. So the story of the Brisker Rav in Europe, who is, I think, the grandfather of Rabbi Soloveitchik, may rest in peace, who died last year, about this time of the year. And a poor widow comes before him with a chicken Friday. It's close to Shabbos. And she's she's had other people look at it, and they all said it wasn't kosher. She comes to Rabbi Soloveitchik, and she looks at it. He said, "It's kosher. Take it home and cook it." So he was greatly criticized, because how could you say that this is kosher? So his answer was, any Amoritz, any ignoramus can say that something's not kosher. It takes a Talmud Chacham, it takes a scholar to know the intricacies of the law, to figure out that it could be a way to make it kosher. He sees a poor woman in front of him, he used every leniency he possibly could in the law. But there's another story that comes about, to my mind, concerns Rabbi Riskin. You see his article in the Jewish Times every Saturday about, on Shabbat Shalom. He tells a story that when he was a rookie rabbi, and a woman in New York, in Manhattan, came to him with a chicken to see if it was kosher right before Shabbos. His response was, "Look, I've been very well trained in the laws of kashrut. All I can tell you is if this is a lung, it's kosher. But if it's a stomach, it's not kosher." In other words, he knew the laws, but he didn't know what he was looking at. That's more or less what's come down to today, because when you buy a kosher chicken today, it's already the feathers are already taken off, and you'll find that the inside's already taken out, and they've already been inspected, and they've already been salted. And if you go to Quality Kosher and you buy your meat here, you find that all the meat that comes out of there has already been kosher. You don't have to worry about it, except for liver. Liver you can't salt to get the blood out, because liver is almost all blood. So the way you prepare liver, if you would want to eat liver, is to you make certain slices, gashes in it, and you have to broil it. You make the gashes in it to allow the blood to drain out. And when you broil, you can make something kosher. Let's say people who really are have a problem with salt, and they can't use salt to kosher, right? So you can broil things without salt, and that takes the blood out also. Put it on a grill. However, the problem is you must have the fire on the bottom. I mean, some authorities permit the fire on top, but I can't see that, because if you broil anything with a fire on top, like you do in the oven, you'll see the blood comes to the top and just sits there. It goes back in. Doesn't really come off. So that's a problem there. So today it's much easier to be kosher, because things are already done for you by the kosher butchers. And then if you have a butcher with a big operation like Quality Kosher has, he will kosher a whole quarter of a piece of beef all at once. He'll soak it and salt it. You have these big vats and these big hoisting things, and that they do it that way. So by the time you get to some of the pieces in the middle, there's hardly any real salt on it. So if you buy from a butcher like that, you can be assured there's probably less meat in there. Now, if you take a look at kosher chickens, you'll see that it's got more feathers on it than you'd see in non-kosher chickens. Non-kosher chickens are perfectly clean. The reason is, after you pull the feathers out, you still got these stubbles of feathers. You can't eviscerate a chicken with hot water like you can a non-kosher chicken. If you use hot water to take out the feathers, if you dip a chicken in boiling water, all the feathers will come right out. But what's the problem with that? The blood is still in the chicken. You can't kosher a chicken with salt. You can't get to the blood to get it to drain out until you get the feathers off. And if you dip in boiling water, you get the feathers off, you'll be cooking it before you get the blood out, and then the blood will stick in there and it won't come out. So if you take a look at a kosher chicken, you see it's got a little more feathers than you're used to. Know that that's the problem. They have to eviscerate it in cold water. It's not as simple. So, but with that exception, kosher chickens generally have a different taste than non-kosher chickens. And a lot of it has to do with the care in which these chickens are raised. Take a look the way non-kosher chickens are brought to market. They're just shoved in these trucks and pushed in, pumped. Now, if you take a look at the kosher chickens, each one has to have a separate box and be very carefully tended to. Why? Because if a chicken is maimed anywhere, it's not kosher. I mean, you can't use it. So you have to take very careful care in handling kosher chickens, which also accounts to a great extent for the great difference in the price of a kosher chicken and a non-kosher chicken. But if you eat a kosher chicken, you should be able to tell the difference. Even in the taste, even the taste of kosher meat too. Part of the reason kosher meat is more expensive is because of the care needed for the slaughtering and the inspection process. And there's a lot of meat that's has to be rejected. Also, kosher markets demand a higher quality of meat, so they send a higher quality of animal to the kosher markets for slaughter, and that also helps with the increase in price. And why prices go up before holidays is something else. Yes.
I seen a document, I think it was on prime time, and they were saying even the kosher market aren't really kosher-ing the meat properly.
Koshering? Well, I could tell you this, that there is a lot of fraud involved in the kosher markets. And we've been, in the past 20 years, the Jewish communities have been trying to a great extent to uncover the fraud when it does exist. I mean, that's why one of the main reasons is that you should buy from a religious butcher who himself is Shomer Shabbos, a religious person. I mean, because I could tell you there are butchers who have been caught in the middle of the night bringing in chickens from a non-kosher market because they could buy them for 39 or 59 cents wholesale, and they're selling it for $1.59 to $1.79. You know, and they've been caught doing things like that. I mean, I know horror stories. I know lots of horror stories like that. And is that probably what this expose was about?
Yeah.
There were 3 or 4 different companies that were surveyed, and of the 4, the kosher markets would have the least percentage
Of
damaged or unsanitary chicken. And it was not just chicken, it was other meats as well. But they have a less percentage.
That's right. Now, one of the things that's important to know, well, you should know about it, but it won't really affect you as a consumer. Meat has to be koshered within 3 days. Otherwise, the blood will start to congeal inside; it won't come out. The only way you get around this is if you water down the meat, and the water itself will rejuvenate the blood and prevent this congealing. So it has to be done every 3 days. So let's say you have a lot of slaughterhouses now in the Midwest. There aren't any slaughterhouses in Atlanta. Let's say slaughterhouses coming from the Midwest to Atlanta with a shipment of meat, and there's a snowstorm, right? Not hard to imagine, and the shipment's not going to get here in 3 days. What do you do? Well, that's why there has to be a mashgiach, which means supervisor, on board, accompanying the meat. In case of an emergency like that, he's to be able to hose down the meat properly to make sure that it's still kosher. There are a lot of things that go wrong in the process. If you have an unscrupulous butcher, you can really be taken. In Atlanta, we don't have a problem with unscrupulous butchers. We have an Atlanta Kashrut Supervising Commission, which does an excellent job of supervising what happens in the community. Okay. Meat and milk, page 112. Why don't we mix meat and milk? He points out on page 113 that meat in Yiddish is fleisch. It's fleisch, or fleischig, means meat, and milk is milchig. So if something is meat, it's called fleischig. If it's dairy, it's called milchig. And if it's neither, it's called parv. Parv. It's an in-between type of thing. Talk about a parv person. Talk about a person who really doesn't have much passion. He's really milquetoast type of personality. But here it refers to its technical term. It's not meat or dairy. Yes.
I have a question as far as cooking parv and your pots and pans. Can you cook pot? Do you have to have separate pots for parv, or can you cook and eat or meat or dairy?
Well,
Something you cook.
what we do is, first of all, you need to have separate pots and pans and dishes for meat and silverware and for dairy.
Right.
Unless you're a vegetarian, you don't have to worry about it. Right? The reason is, if you take a look under a microscope, you'll see that all these utensils, with the exception of glass, have pores. And when they're subject to heat, the pores open. They will absorb food and emit food. And so one way of making something kosher, if it wasn't kosher, is to dip it in boiling water. It will open up the pores, and everything that wasn't kosher will come out. Right? So we have separate. Since you're not going to kosher all your dishes and utensils every time you use it, the best thing to do is to just have separate set for meat, separate set for dairy. Glass is a super cool liquid; it doesn't have any pores. The problem with glass is it scratches, and then you get food particles getting in the scratches, and it's hard. I don't know how many of you have worked with Pyrex, which is glass, but how many of you know that you just cannot get Pyrex absolutely clean if you use it again and again? There'll still be places that you just won't come clean. So we have a custom not to use glass for both meat and milk, with the exception some people use glasses like for water or soda or something like that for meat and milk, because it really doesn't get much use. And But even then, it's best to have separate, but it's not really necessary. The way to kosher glass is if you dip it in boiling water, it'll probably break. So we say you can soak it in water for 72 hours, changing the water every 24 hours. That's how you kosher glass. Now, what if something is parv? Parv means you can eat it with dairy or meat. Let's say you make fish is considered parv. So fish is not considered to be meat or dairy. As technically, I told you before that chicken was in that category, although the rabbis put the chicken in the category of meat. So let's say you make gefilte fish for Shabbos dinner on Friday night, and you want to serve it for the dairy meal the following day. Can you do it? So one way to do it is to have a set of things that are just parv that you cook. If you can be careful about maintaining parv utensils, by all means do it.
So you'd have to wash them separately from
Yeah, you can wash it in the sink, but be careful it doesn't come in contact with other things, and you don't use the same sponge to wash it with. It gets complicated.
Yeah.
It gets complicated. So in my house, we don't even have the concept of parv. But I can tell you this: if you make gefilte fish and you're serving it the next day and it's cold, right? Then since it's cold, it's still parv, and it's not going to send particles here and there. So I would say that, especially if you eat it on a paper plate or something, it wouldn't be a problem to eat it with the dairy meal.
Rabbi, can I ask you about a fish?
Yeah.
There's a lot of controversy about stored fish.
Okay, I didn't get to that yet, but let's get to it now. Okay, fish has to have fins and scales.
Mm-hmm.
Question is, what does that mean? Swordfish has fins and scales when it's in its childhood, but when it matures, the scales fall off. Same thing with sturgeon, sea sturgeon, not lake sturgeon, but sea sturgeon. So the conservative movement in America, what they did was, they sent a letter 25 years ago to the head of wildlife in Washington to find out if what a swordfish and a sturgeon have are really considered scales. The surgeon wrote back, yes. The surgeon, the head of wildlife, wrote back, yes. And so the conservative movement permitted the use of swordfish and sturgeon, sea sturgeon. Then, however, Rabbi Moshe Tendler in Monsey, New York, who happens to be a professor of biology at Yeshiva University as well, wrote a long treatise about this, stating that yes, they are scales, but they're not considered the Torah's definition of scales because they fall off. So 90% of the kosher world, at least, will not eat swordfish or sea sturgeon because the scales aren't considered viable scales because they fall off when they mature. That's a bone of contention. While I'm talking about things like this, I'm talking about cheese. What is cheese? How do you make cheese? Does everybody make cheese? Huh?
Which is made.
You know how to make cheese? Take a big vat of milk and you let it sour, right? And eventually it turns to cheese. But if you want to speed it up, it takes a long time. You throw in something called rennet, and that really acts as a catalytic agent and helps the cheese gel. That's a problem in ancient time. Not too ancient, not too long ago. I mean, I would even say there are some places where this is done today. If you take a stomach of an animal and you fill it with, and you take the ends that have openings and you tie it and you fill it with milk, and you come back and you just let it sit for a bit and it'll come back, it'll be cheese. That's why it has that shape, right? Because rennet is an enzyme in the stomach linings of an animal. And then the ancient people learned a long time ago that that's a good way to make cheese. Put it in the stomach of an animal. That's why it had that shape. What we do today to get cheese is you take the stomach linings of an animal, you dry them up, and you grind it into a fine powder, and you throw that in. Well, what's the problem? Meat and milk, right? Which is a forbidden mixture. So, actually, kosher cheese can be made with kosher rennet.
More from vegetables.
Wait a minute. I'm talking about for meat. Of course, if you make it from vegetable rennet, there's no problem. As a matter of fact, Kraft cheese. We know, it's been said, that half of Kraft cheese is made with vegetable rennet. But since you never know which is which batch comes out with the vegetable rennet, you can't eat Kraft cheese. So, but there is such a thing. But I would say it's possible to make kosher cheese with meat rennet. How is that possible? Now, it's a little complicated, so I'll give you a little intricacies of Jewish law and how the Talmud works here a little bit. So, try to focus a little bit because it's not simple. The Talmud learns that what is forbidden about meat and milk is the taste. The taste of meat and milk. It says tam k'ikar. The taste is the essential thing. We also have a law of 1 in 60. I don't know if I told you about that. I didn't. Here's the law of 1 in 60. That if you're cooking chicken soup, and you're holding a baby, and he's got a bottle of milk, and he flings the bottle somewhere, and a drop of milk goes flying, and it lands in the chicken soup, do you have to throw it out? Well, you try to take it out if you can still find it with a spoon or something, But and you leave the rest there. Otherwise, you leave it there, and it's still kosher.
It's such a small percentage.
Right, because it's less than 1/60th of the total. It loses its identity in the soup. It's considered like it's not there. We come up with a proportion of 1 in 60. How do we do that? As you will see in the next weeks in the Torah reading in the synagogue, we talk about animal sacrifices, which is another subject we should talk about another time. One of the sacrifices is an olah, a burnt offering, where the entire animal is sacrificed whole. Then it was cut up and then distributed between the priests and the Levites and the people who were bringing the sacrifice. I mean, it used to bother me a lot that we would use animal sacrifices for our worship, even in ancient times, till I realized that this is how the priests and the Levites ate, because they didn't have a possession of land like all the other people did. And this is how they fed their families. And it was properly slaughtered and everything else. But how were they able to eat this olah sacrifice, this whole burnt offering, if it has the forbidden parts in it, along with the permitted? There are forbidden parts of an animal. For instance, the chaylev, which you would call the cellulite fat in the rear of an animal, that lumpy fat that comes near the tenderloin area. I don't know if you know about animals. There's also something called the gid hanosha, the sinew vein. Story of Jacob when he was wrestling with the angel, and the angel grabbed him by the thigh in the sinew vein, somewhere around here, and so we don't eat that vein. And the vein has to be removed in order to make it kosher. And since it's such a pain in the rear, so to speak, pardon the pun, to remove that vein takes a lot of work, and to remove all the chaylev, that special cellulite-like fat, Jews don't generally eat in America the hind quarter. We just eat the rest of the animal and send the hind quarter to the non-kosher markets. But in Israel, where labor is cheap and meat is scarce, they do eat the hind quarter, and they spend the labor on doing it. And you can go to the King David Grill Room at the King David Hotel in Jerusalem and get a kosher porterhouse steak, which you can't get in America. So there are forbidden parts to the animal that you're not allowed to eat. And then there's the blood. All right, so when they slaughter it, they can drain a lot of the blood, but they can't drain it at all. So, what do? The Torah says it's permitted to eat it, and it commands you to eat it. So the rabbis figured out what the percentage of the forbidden and the permitted parts of the animal is, and the percentage was 1 in 60. So then from this, that if the percentage of forbidden to permissible is less than 1/60th, it could be kosher, as long as you cannot recognize it. That's there; its identity is lost. So, yes.
That's just like you boil an egg. Egg can have blood in it.
Blood spot.
But if you boil it, as long as you don't know it's in there, so it's permissible to eat it, right?
But if you come across it, that it's there, that's another law itself. In a Jewish home, before you cook eggs, like scrambled eggs or something, you open up an egg, and you put it in a bowl or a glass and you inspect it to see if there's a blood spot. If there's a blood spot, throw it out. But boiled eggs, you can't do that, right? So, we rely on the fact that most eggs don't have a blood spot, so you can eat it. But if you do find it, right, then you throw it out. Although I've never found a blood spot in a boiled egg.
In any egg.
Oh, really?
I've never seen one either.
Yeah. Well, I don't eat many eggs anymore since I found out about my cholesterol, so that's done with. But if you do find a blood spot in an egg that's been boiled, although I've never seen that happen. If you have 2 other eggs in the pot, does it make the other 2 eggs not kosher? No, because you follow the majority. Follow the majority, and it's probably less than 1/60th of the total volume to the blood spot too. Anyway, where was I? Okay, so this percentage of 1/60 is very important to understand a process of cheese. So when you throw in the rennet into the milk, it's less than 1/60th of the volume, much less. However, there's another problem. You might think it'd be permitted, but we know it's not permitted as long as you can recognize that the meat is still there. That the forbidden the part is still there. And you can recognize that the rennet is still there. Why? It made the cheese gel. So that the Talmud says davar hamami be'alef lo batul. That something that makes something gel, even 1 in 1,000 is not. It doesn't lose its identity. However, and this is how it works. Since what's not permitted is the taste of meat and milk, so when the rennet was put into the milk, it was never enough rennet in proportion to the milk to create a taste of meat and milk. So there was never anything forbidden, because there was so much more milk than rennet. Even though it made a gel, it's still permitted. Having said that, if you go buy rennetless cheese, you're probably better off. And you can find rennetless cheese in places. The kosher cheese probably made today mostly with vegetable rennet.
Is there another name for it? Is it always called rennet? Or there's some derivative?
No, that's called rennet.
Okay.
Rennet. If you go to health food stores, you see rennetless cheese, and of course there's kosher cheeses, which probably made with vegetable rennet. Miller's cheese and Migdal and other brands. I think Quality Kosher has it. I think you can get a lot of them in Kroger's in Toco Hills.
We went, my mother and I went to Kroger, and we were having a hard time finding kosher cheese and milk.
In Toco Hills?
Mm-hmm.
It's in the section. It's in the dairy section.
Yeah, we were over in the dairy.
There's a whole section of kosher cheeses
We must have missed
on the.
that.
It's on the left. You know, you round the corner.
And then we were looking at all the milk.
sour cream.
And the other side. It's on the side with the milk.
Oh. Okay.
Milk. All the milks here are kosher. Yeah. Okay. That's best if you have, when you set up a kosher kitchen, to have a dairy sink and a meat sink. Well, what happens if you rent an apartment and you only have one sink? What do you do? Well, the sink will have to be used for both. So you do the best you can. So you can put a drain board, and you have a drain board for meat and a drain board for dairy. Just don't fill it up with water, sink up with water. If you need to soak the dishes, do it in a tub, a Rubbermaid tub or something like that. You should have counters set aside. This is a dairy counter. This is a meat counter. How do you make a kosher? Pour boiling water on it.
Same with the sink.
Same with the sink. Now, hopefully you'll have a metal sink, and metal sinks are easy to kosher with boiling water. Porcelain sinks are much more problematic. And that does anybody have a porcelain sink?
I don't think so.
Good. I don't have to worry about it. The way you kosher for Passover is the same way. Whenever you're using boiling water, you must use rocks or something, a piece of metal or something that is heated on. For instance, I'll take a rock about half the size of my fist, not this big, but a little, half the size. Put it on the fire. So when I'm about to kosher something, I'll take the rock not with my hand, but with a pair of pliers, and put it in the water. Why? Because when for instance, if you're dipping forks or silverware or something like in the water, they're cold. It'll bring down the heat of the water. So, but if you put the rocks, which have a lot of heat in it, it'll maintain the heat of the water. If you're koshering a countertop or a sink, probably the best thing to do would be to use like an electric coffee pot.
Mm-hmm.
Keep it plugged in; it'll keep it boiling. You just go around, And it'd be much easier if you could control the flow of things that way, instead of getting it all over the place. But when you're ready to set up a kosher kitchen, the best thing to do is contact me, and we'll talk about it. And By the way, if you don't have this book, you should get it. Blue Greenberg's book, How to Run a Traditional Jewish Household.
Good.
She's got a lot of good helpful hints in there. Cold, hot and cold. Remember I said before the utensils won't emit or absorb particles when it's cold because the pores are not open. So what do? You want to have you're out on a town and you go into a non-kosher restaurant. Can you eat anything? Let's say you're in Helen, Georgia, or something. Not easy to find a kosher place to eat there, right? And you're real hungry, right? You go into a restaurant. What do? You order a salad. So you're eating on a plate that's not kosher, eating on a fork that's not. It's cold. It's clean. You don't have to worry. If it's not clean, you shouldn't be there anyway, right?
But you have to worry about the salad dressing.
That's right. If they give you a salad dressing, ask them what it is. If they give you a little packet of salad dressing, take a look at it. See what the ingredients are.
What if you just use oil and vinegar? Wouldn't that be?
You could use oil and vinegar. Make sure it's not wine vinegar, which is something we'll talk about at another time. And we'll have ice cream for dessert, maybe. That's okay, as long as it's kosher ice cream. Like Howard Johnson's, we know is kosher ice cream. And so you can go to Howard Johnson's and have ice cream. That'd be good. Yes.
In that book, in the How to Run a Traditional Jewish House, she had an interesting idea. She said, if you want to eat this, she said, you just call ahead of time. And she said, and make sure that they just cook it in like tin foil.
That's right.
Wrap it up in tin foil and let them cook it, and then they would have to break out a new plate, of course.
Right. You can make those arrangements. I had a steak dinner in Las Vegas, 1970. And there were no kosher establishments in Las Vegas. I had one, I think it was a Sands Hotel or something like that. How did I do it? The local rabbi in town had an arrangement with this hotel, and I found someone who knew him, and I went to see him, and he set this up for me. He had a grill top, special grill top that he brought them, and kosher steaks that he brought them, and utensils, and they made it for us whenever he was there. It's best not to do things like that if you don't have to, because who's going to be there watching him and supervising it? And if you can do that, I mean, fine. But if you're in a case where you really don't have much choice, you try to make the best arrangements that you can of this sort. You can manage. But sometimes if you go to rural communities in Georgia, it's very hard to manage. It's very hard to go into a restaurant and find a restaurant that sells salad without bacon in it, or that sells salad, period. But you can manage. You really can. I've gone all over the world and been able to eat. I mean, when I went to Hawaii, I had arranged on a honeymoon. I had arranged to have these kosher frozen dinners, and they were just awful. They're just the airplane meals and stuff, and they must have been sitting there for I don't know how many years in their freezer. So they were just not good. You're in Hawaii, the best fruits and vegetables in the world. That's what we ate for a week. It was wonderful. I really grew to love avocados and macadamia nuts. Yeah.
Avocados have a lot of fat.
I was skinny in those days.
When you go to a restaurant, you'll be able to take long to wrap up your home.
Yeah, I guess you can do that. Sure. Yeah, that's a good idea.
I read a small avocado the first time with that.
Yeah, avocado's a lot of fat. Okay. Please take a copy of this Kashrut guide.